usher those at the door. Okay, great. Welcome back, everybody. It's my pleasure to start the Fireside chat with Will McCaskill. As you guys probably know, Will is an associate professor in philosophy at Oxford University and a senior research fellow at the Global Priorities Institute. He's also the director of the Forethought Foundation for Global Priorities Research and the co-founder and president of the Center for Effective Altruism. Will is also the author of the books Doing Good Better and Moral Uncertainty, and he has an upcoming book on long-termism called What We Owe the Future. I actually think an email's just gone out about a link to pre-order the book, so you can kind of get a sneak peek that way. Please post any questions you have on the Swapcard app, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But please, firstly, join me in warmly welcoming Will. So we were in a similar position this time, October last year at EAG London, and a big topic of discussion was your book. So yeah, what kind of lessons have you learned since then, and what work has been done on the book?
Yeah, so the kind of final stage there was fact-checking, which was this just enormous amount of work, maybe like way more than I expected. Mm-hmm. I think I estimate about 2 person years of work just went into fact-checking, mm-hmm. which is like maybe several books worth of time. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think one thing I've just kind of continued to, perhaps too slowly, kind of update on over time is just how many facts that float around and like even like widely accepted are just false. And I mean, I think we saw this kind of very well with COVID as well. There was this, it's very slow for medical establishment to update that actually it's airborne. And like you end up, you dig into the roots of that, and it goes back to this like idea that particles more than 5 microns can't be airborne, whereas actually they totally can. Probably this like totally changes how we think of the respiratory diseases in general. But yeah, I think like in the course of writing the book, I would often just be taking like, if there's some claim that's just very widely, like from a like sufficiently established source, like the IPCC, or just kind of something that's like often repeated by the like leading academics in the field, you think, okay, cool, this is like a pretty safe thing to just include. And then you come back to it, fact checking will just like confirm that. Whereas, I don't know, I'd feel like 50% of the time or something, it's like, no, actually this isn't true, or it's overstated, or it's misleading or something. And yeah, I don't know, that's tough.
It's also kind of scary if you think about...
yeah, I mean, you end up like a flat earther or something. Yeah. You're like, you can't trust anybody anymore, yeah. And like, I've just got to do your own research. And yeah, no, it's a bad kind of situation to be in. But it's like, I don't know, Holden has this post minimal trust investigations, and I really endorse it. I think it's something that I was very slow to kind of appreciate, because it's a view that's like somewhat critical of academia. Like the optimistic view is you see academia as just this font of knowledge, and it produces knowledge, and it's like you're building a cathedral like brick by brick. Whereas really, actually, it's this like social institution, and you can very often get these claims that get widely reported, and people come to believe them as kind of widely accepted, but actually they're, I mean, yeah, often it's the claims that might just be like not true, or they're just actually, and this is also very often the case, they're not like quite useful for the thing that you care about. So I don't know, in climate science, the standard measure is like equilibrium climate sensitivity. But that's kind of this weird measure actually, where it's like you have a certain pulse of CO2 emissions, and you assume it's like that CO2 concentration stays the same in the atmosphere, which is kind of fine if you're thinking on shorter timelines. But if you're thinking about longer timelines, which I was, it really matters that, well, there's 2 ways in which it matters that end up kind of canceling out. But one is the fact that CO2 gets absorbed over time. Another, though, is these longer term kind of feedback effects. And it ends up being like, actually like really decision relevant that this, whether you use this equilibrium climate sensitivity or something, not, and it's like, it can be extremely hard to just kind of disentangle that if you're asking a slightly different question than is the kind of academic norm. And so as well as the pure fact-checking, there's also just, does the claim that is being made like actually support the thing you're precisely interested in? Because it can often like just miss.
And did that mean that lots of the book had to change when you just put things in there thinking they were kind of trusted facts and then they changed? How much of the book had to change in response to that?
Yeah, at that stage, not like enormous changes. There was some stuff that just got cut. So one area, there's this area of research, the kind of persistent studies, which, yeah, literature, which is within economics, and it's looking at very long-term effects. So one of the best studies and most important studies in this area is like, you look at which areas of Africa lost the most people to enslavement from both the trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trades and the transatlantic trade. And this varied from location to location for fairly arbitrary reasons. Now, look today, and this is over the course of many hundreds of years, like 11th century to the 19th century. Now you look today, like what's GDP per capita in different areas. And so there is this study that's suggesting actually like greater rate of enslavement historically leads to lower GDP per capita today. And that's like one of many examples of looking at these kind of long-term persistent effects. And now you hear that, and if you're like familiar with what's the liability of social science in general, you think, oh, maybe this is just, maybe it doesn't really check out. And so I did commission Jaime Sevilla to just do like a kind of deep dive looking into it. His conclusion, I think, was like, this isn't as bad as you might think. He came in like extremely pessimistic, extremely skeptical, and now thinks like, still pretty skeptical. And I think a number of the studies, you know, they have major issues, often for like extremely technical reasons. But he did replications of like a handful of studies I was interested in. And so he did come out like actually more pessimistic. He's like, this is of, you know, some evidential value. I kind of always thought of it as like history plus. Yeah. So you can look at history, you get these grand narratives. There was already this narrative of the impact of the slave trade on burgeoning African civilizations. You get this kind of gun-slave cycle is what historians called it, where once you've got this strong incentive for a local community to like sell slaves, well, you've got this incentive to do raiding of, you know, other groups nearby. Now, in order to protect against that raiding, you need to buy guns from the Europeans. How can you have money to buy guns? By selling slaves. And so it was this like vicious cycle that just like destroyed burgeoning African like governmental infrastructure, essentially. And so there was this plausible qualitative case. And so then I see these kind of long-run persistent studies. It's like, hey, we're just adding to this. It's not of the same level as other sorts of, you know, very, very robust social science research that you can replicate many times. So anyway, that was me like defending the literature a little bit. Nonetheless, we cut it all out. Yeah. Nonetheless, it just decided like it didn't quite meet the evidential bar that I really wanted to place a lot of weight on it. Certainly because it's just very hard to communicate kind of nuance about the kind of level of quality of a literature. So yeah, that just got removed. There were some other discussions that we just felt were kind of, yeah, low enough evidential quality, they got cut out. There's this question of if humans went extinct, would some sort of technologically capable life re-evolve? We ended up just kind of cutting that. Partly just it wasn't so relevant. But much more often it's about just like, oh, and then just like like so many like little facts. Often they're the kind of these like, oh, did you know, like asides, and often did you know, it's like actually you didn't know because it wasn't true. It just sounds really good. Yeah. So a lot of them got cut.
I mean, I would like a book of those, please. Yeah, if it's just all the kind of facts you think are true but are in fact not true.
I know, we actually want to, like, I'm tempted to try and like have a write-up of this thing, of like things that just didn't pass the test. Yeah. Sometimes I like still want to tell the story, so there is this claim, and often it's not like it's false, it's just like we don't really know. There's this claim that like the leading cause of death among Chinese emperors in, I think it was like the 11th century AD, but I might well have got the dates wrong, was drinking mercury in a quest for immortality. And that fact is like not supported, but now you're all going to remember it and repeat it. There definitely was a trend. There definitely was this trend for Chinese emperors to pursue immortality. There was like attempted mercury elixirs, but like just the like that strengthening of it, such that it's like, oh, that'd be such a nice little fact. It's probably not true.
Yeah. And then how do you convey all of this fact-checking in the book? So the precipice is about 50% book, 50% notes. Have you taken a similar approach?
I really wanted to, I mean, that's kind of a cool thing about the precipice, I think. I was aiming to keep the footnotes much smaller, and so I'm kind of in between a normal book and Toby's book.
Yeah.
So I think the word count of What We Owe the Future is like 90,000 or something, 100,000 words, and the word count of the end notes, I think about 60,000. So it's not that
font.
far away, and it's going to be smaller font.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of them are just going to be online. So we had a bit of a fight with the publishers because they were like, "What's this?
Yeah.
You've just got this extra whole book in the end notes."
Yeah.
And so a lot of the more discursive ones are just you'll have to get them online.
And when did you wrap the project up? When did you do the final submission of the book?
Final submission was on the 2nd of December. In this like mad, well, there's so many like not quite final submissions. So the thing I think of as the final submission was this like 2nd of December where it was this like mad rush because we were like trying to finish all of these things. And so I was like, I had to fly to this conference in Arizona. And so I was just like doing it on the flight and like, I realized on the flight, I was meant to be just doing these like fact checking, or not fact checking, but like style, just small changes. And then I was like, I just don't feel happy with chapter 4. I think it needs a totally new structure. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to do it. And then completely revise chapter 4. But then that meant that, yeah, I just had to like stay up through the night and then like miss the first day of the conference because I was just like desperately finishing it and then like sent it off. But then there's just all these final edits. So like now we've got the kind of proofs and then it's like final stages of copy editing. But yeah. The date at which in my mind I was like, okay, this is now gone, the 2nd of December.
Did you do anything to celebrate, mark the occasion after several years of, and how many human years of input into the book?
How many human years went into it? I admit it was a bit, we kind of had a celebration, but it was like before the book, because I was away, like, that was in fact the deadline, was like the fact that I had to go to the US. So it meant that we did have this like, oh, end of book celebration, but it was like, a week before the hand-in, so it was a little bit more muted. So I think what we're going to do is like when we have a physical book, maybe we'll have a little party.
Nice. And so we can pre-order the book now, and the book, is that correct?
That's right, yep.
And the book comes out in September?
Yeah, so in the UK it comes out 1st of September, it comes out 16th of August in the US. Okay.
So, you know, besides book stuff, if there really even has been anything other than book stuff. Yeah, what have you been up since we last spoke in October?
Okay, yeah, I mean, the big thing has been, I'm now advising Future Fund. So, you know, in this trip to the US, it was just like, I'd been planning to go to the US for 2 years and had attempted several times, or twice, and like just not been able to get in. And so I just wanted to see kind of like what was up with a bunch of people that I hadn't seen for quite a while. And that included like meeting up with Nick and Sam. And yeah, it was just kind of clear that Sam was just ramping up his giving like a lot faster than I had previously thought.
Yeah.
And that the kind of conversations I was having with Nick about how to do things were just like, seemed like I was providing a lot of value. And so, yeah, I had this plans of like, oh, I'll do this like US trip and then book is in, I'm going to have this like nice, like kind of more fallow period. I'm going to go traveling and like see my family and so on. And I just canceled all of that and started focusing on helping with the Future Fund. But that's kind of still, I'm like an advisor, you know, it's like, I'm trying to spend maybe up to like half my time of it this year or something. I don't know if it'll be an ongoing commitment, but it seems just particularly it seemed like it could be particularly helpful at the like very early stages, where it's like, what's the broad strategy, what's the culture, who are the early hires, things like that.
Yeah. Great, and I guess this ties into, you were speaking about mega projects last year and things that the EA community could do. You spoke about buying coal mines and shutting them down or setting up new universities. Like, are any new ideas here? Are there anything you're really excited about in this space?
Yeah, I think there's just tons of ideas. So within pandemic preparedness, that's definitely like unusually concrete ideas. So what are some examples there? One is early detection. So you could have just a number of countries, or ideally it's just worldwide, just constantly monitoring wastewater and like scanning to see if there are like any suspicious like potential pathogens in the wastewater, so you could like respond much faster. Another one is creating what they're calling kind of super PPE, so personal protective equipment that's just completely kind of airtight, such that you would be like completely protected against some new pathogen. Various forms of like physical sterilization, so via UV or kind of other sorts of like non-biological sterilization seems like very promising. Also the stuff with Alvea is extremely exciting, very rapid vaccine development. Then I have the regulations in place such that you can get like very fast vaccines deployed. That's all like super exciting.
And they've grown exceptionally quickly, right? They've gone from a team of 0 to...
Team of 40, I think, at the moment.
Yeah.
It's like really fast they've been going, yeah. And then they're planning, as I understand it, for there to be kind of like a bio startup foundry, actually, and perhaps with this early detection stuff, being kind of the number one thing they might start focusing on. So yeah, that's the area that has like very clear concrete projects. One thing that's pretty striking is that often, I think people often like coming into EA long-termism think it's kind of like, oh, it's AI, bio, and then that's kind of it. Whereas like, certainly on the current margin, just given there's been like a lot of focus on that, and certainly when you start thinking about making larger grants, often stuff that's in the category of, what we think of as broad long-termism, actually just seems very promising. So things that are just generally improving, society's ability to have collective, accurate beliefs and act on the basis of them in appropriate ways, start to seem better and better. And so...
Because they're more scalable or because they...
I think it's partly just us neglecting. I think there's a few things. Like, one is an us neglectingness thing. Second, there's just like lots of potential things you can do. Whereas, and then it's also just often easier for people to do without kind of enormous amounts of context. So, the bio projects I mentioned are unusually kind of low risk, but there are certainly bio projects you could also do that are that's involved, using perhaps potentially dual use technology or something where it's like, oh, there's also a risk that you could be doing harm as well as good. And that's like much harder to kind of go quickly on. But if it's something about just improving expert aggregation or having a super forecasting institute where you're helping make being a forecaster like a full-time job, like these are things you can just kind of get going with. It's like very hard to see how you're going to end up doing harm by doing that. Yeah,
and I guess it kind of relates to what you touched on in your opening talk about aiming high, being ambitious, doing good. And that's a very simple meme to put out there, but I guess what are the nuances around that? What would you like people to think about in addition to just being ambitious and aiming high?
Yep. Great. I mean, yeah, the kind of I guess honestly, yeah, the biggest worry I have with that earlier meme of mine is that I don't know if there's this assumption that okay, now any old idea is going to get enormous amounts of funding, and it's no, there's still we still have this very high bar. We still want to have as much of an impact as possible. That means that means what you should be doing is trying to create projects that could scale, which is not really the mode we've been in before, and might be quite might be a quite different strategy. But that doesn't mean like you're immediately jumping to this project that has a budget of tens of millions or 100 million per year or something. It might be you're starting with a project that has a budget of 100,000 a year or $1 million per year or something. But that like when demonstrating that you're really crushing it, you can scale up that much. So that's kind of like one potential worry. Like I have actually been like quite surprised in a very positive way by how much people have responded to that earlier message. And people are really now trying to think like about scalable projects rather than just like what can we do in the margin. The cases where I've seen that go wrong are more in the lines of, okay, yeah, I want to do the same thing, but now I'm going to use larger numbers, and I've like not actually got a plan for like how we could spend large amounts of money well. That's the way in the kind of which it most goes wrong. And then the other thing is just worrying about like creating this like big bloated kind of EA community where I think we should just often look to like what are failure modes that happen in other social movements or the nonprofit world. I mean, and by default assume that we are not immune to them either. Yep. And one very common thing, which is exactly the criticism we started off in EA making, is like bad charities don't die because someone sets up a project, they're really invested in it, they're really excited about it, and they just want it to keep going, even if it's actually like it would be better if it just shut down and whoever's working there work elsewhere. And the worry if we have kind of more funding accessible for projects is like you lose a bit of that like incentive mechanism where it's like, oh, maybe a like mediocre project, which is like not doing active harm in its work, but there's an opportunity cost even of just the people working there. I don't know, it would be a bad state if lots of those things just kind of kept on going. And so, I don't know, I kind of love to see some way of like having a badge of honor, as it were, even like you get a prize or something if you're like, oh, I tried this thing, it didn't work, I've shut it down. Like, I think that's just like amazing. Like, should just be like, regarded as like a very cool thing to do.
Yeah, and I think there is something in like current EA culture where people are willing to give constructive feedback, and and I hope that that doesn't get lost as we grow.
Yeah, for sure, I agree.
So, I guess with we talk about the EA community and views in the EA community, but obviously it's not a homogenous community. There are many people focusing on many different things and who have disagreements across all of these areas. Are there sort of EA topics which you feel like you're actually in the minority of versus the EA community? Okay,
yeah, I think it's a good kind of two things I want to say on that. Like one is I think it's just, like very easy for people to have this feeling like there's the EA community and it has like this monolithic set of beliefs where, and I think this is maybe especially true because there are some people who like make those beliefs public and like that can get taken as like the standard or like, oh, does that just represent everybody? And this was true for me as well. Like when I started doing the kind of background research and thinking for the book, and I was like, okay, in those cases where I had maybe previously been deferring, I hadn't like looked into myself, I want to like get a better sense. And I did have this background thought of like, oh, everyone has the same view on AI or bio or all these other things. And that meant I started off being like confused because I was like, why does someone have this view? Like, this number seems way too high or something. And often the answer is actually like, no, there's just like tons of disagreement. And it's just that like sometimes particular views get more airtime. So that's one thing is like, in most cases, it's like, oh, I'm in a little minority here. It's like often, maybe it's like a very significant minority, maybe it's the majority. The biggest thing, and so I have no idea if I'm in the minority or majority here, but certainly this thing where there's an issue that seems extremely important, where there's this enormous disagreement, like disagreements spanning many orders of magnitude, is, well, there's kind of two ways into it. One is like, what's the expected value of the future conditional on survival? Like, here's kind of two worldviews. One is just, don't mess up too badly. So don't go extinct, no global catastrophes, no like really AI takeover, really intense totalitarian lock-in. Then over time, we'll just converge to something that's like near the best kind of civilization we can have. There's this other view that we could call the kind of radical contingency view, which is just the sort of future you end up with is like very, very sensitively determined by what moral values and beliefs and practices are present today, let's say. And then obviously you can have a spectrum between that. And if you have this convergence view, then probably you think the future is really pretty good, conditional on survival, where you could imagine like saying like, let's say 0 is just, extinction is neither good nor bad, 100%, maybe that's not meaningful in this context, but at least if there's like a finite amount of value that could be achieved, 100% is the best possible thing. You might think there it's like, okay, 20% or 30% of the best possible state if we don't have any of those real kind of existential risks. If you have this radical contingency view, then maybe you're like, no, it just could end up as anything, so you might have a much, much lower number. And so, yeah, numbers I've heard are more like 1 in a million kind of level of value, and even an expectation that you achieve. And that makes big differences for how you prioritize in a number of ways. I mean, a big thing is how much do you care about extinction risk versus trying to improve the value of the future conditional on survival. It also relates to how you evaluate different sorts of event. So a couple of examples. One is like the Trinity test, the first nuclear test, where the people at the time had some non-negligible chance that this would set off a chain reaction in the atmosphere and completely destroy the world. If you have this view that like really all that matters is reducing extinction risk, then you think, okay, that was just like a really bad move, given what they believed at the time. If you have this other view, which is like, no, actually the values that are dominant today really have this like in expectation persistent impact, then it becomes at least very unclear, because ensuring that Germany didn't win World War II is like a very big deal for that, from that perspective. It also really matters for how you evaluate certain things that might change what values are predominant at kind of crucial moments of technological development. So a catastrophe that killed a large number of people, sets back progress, technological progress, obviously like unimaginable tragedy in itself. But then there's also this question of like, well, does it like change the values that are like predominant at those like crucial times in the future? Similarly with technological stagnation. That again, if we were to stagnate technologically for hundreds of years or thousands of years, the moral values that would be guiding crucial technological transitions, such as to AGI, would be very different. And it's very underexplored whether it's like, would they be better or worse?
I mean, thankfully, there's enough disagreement that people are working on all of these things. Where do you sit in between the two?
Oh, like, yeah, I mean, certainly my like starting intuitions are much more towards, well, actually, yeah, I've now kind of lost a sense of what my initial thoughts on this were, perhaps. But yeah, I think I'm generally more sympathetic to the kind of radical contingency view than the kind of convergence view. It's kind of funny how people's views on this aren't necessarily what you'd predict, because you would expect that people who are kind of more moral realist, sympathetic, would have a more optimistic take. People who are more subjectivist would, think it's more likely to be contingent. But the arguments I get into, like, I'm often the moral realist, sympathetic one. They're the subjectivist, and they're the super optimistic, and I'm like, I'm more moderate. But yeah, so that's like a big thing. And I think like what I feel I learned over the last few years increased my degree of belief in the, oh no, actual quite radical contingency view, where in significant part that's just like learning about history over time. So in the book I have this long discussion of abolition of slavery, and certainly coming into that I would have been like, well, obviously that was just like an inevitable occurrence. Now my view is like, no, it seems actually like it was a model change. I think that model change, rather than like an economic change in particular, I think is really quite plausible. Things could have gone in a different way such that slavery was not regarded as the kind of abominable act that we now regard it as.
I mean, so a lot of these topics are obviously just really heavy and you have to think about them all of the time for your work. Mm-hmm. How do you balance that with kind of looking after your well-being and making sure, things don't get too depressing? Yeah,
it's, so when I was a teenager, I read a lot of existentialism, and there's this idea of like the only appropriate, I don't really know let's see where I'm going with this. Yeah. But they're the only kind of appropriate response to like the meaninglessness of life is this like ironic absurdity. And I think of that like sometimes where it's like, it feels like if you were acting in what is in a sense like the morally appropriate way in response to just like the world, like the way the world is, you just like, all you would be doing is like vomiting or like crying or like screaming. And obviously it wouldn't be a very productive way of being. And so like, well, what's the alternative? And it's like, though in some sense it's like regarding, like the thing you have to do is just to start, like doing the best you can and like trying to not like constantly think about the suffering in the world. But it does feel like this, absurd, like absurd position to be in. And so like, sometimes I end up with this kind of like, like I'm not quite sure where I'm going on this, but like, like this, it's kind of like a detachment or something with like, you've got no other option, I think, if you want to like, really do the thing that's actually right, which is like work as hard as you can and look after yourself as well and like not burn out. It's like you have to kind of be in this like detached mode of being with respect to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember a conversation I had with Kevin Esfelt, who's a bioethicist at MIT, and in his work, and he's one of the foremost professors focused on biosecurity. And I had a conversation with him, and to be productive, you can't think about all of the suffering in the world. And he helped me tap into that, and I just went to the bathroom and cried. And I was like, okay, oh, no. Put that in a box, and then you have to do that to be able to be productive. I think. I think a lot of EAs are very sensitive to that, and it's a really difficult thing to manage, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think like a big thing for me was just like developing like a multiple sense of identity. So I like very strongly invest in maintaining kind of old relationships I have from school, like maintaining this like very strong like non-EA set of friends, in particular in Oxford, like trying to have like, continue a good relationship with my family and stuff as well. Where possible, have like hobbies that are like just for the sake of them as well. And that's like, I think that's particularly important because it means like if your work is going well, you have something else to fall back on. Whereas I think for the first few years that I was working on the stuff, or even I guess maybe the first like 6 years, it was a little bit more all-consuming. And that would mean like, if I thought I was screwing up at this, it was like, okay, I'm just, that would be like my entire life is going badly. Whereas now it's like, okay, no, okay, sure, this is annoying, but like, I can get out of it by spending time with communities of people who for whom this is not such a big deal.
Yeah, it's sometimes kind of refreshing when your parents don't really understand what you do, and they're just sort of like happy and proud of you anyway. They're like, oh, good job.
Yeah, that is nice, definitely.
So what are some of these hobbies?
Hobbies, I got into music. So we talked about this a little bit, like, Yeah, I got into music production like a few years ago. This is actually something that I've like has withered a little bit because the issue is, you know, you spend all day on a laptop like working away, and it's like, oh, what am I going to do for fun now? And it's like, back on the laptop. It is extremely engrossing and like very enjoyable.
Is it DJ Mccaskill or?
DJ Mccaskill. Came up with so many possible DJ names. Charismatic Megafauna was one that I liked. Funky Glyptodon was another. There were more too, yeah.
Big Mac?
Big Mac, classic. Yeah. Well, that's what my housemate Ellie calls me, Big Mac, yeah. Although now she might have started on Macaroon as of last night.
Oh, nice.
So maybe that could also be a DJ name. So that was another one. And then like, yeah, a lot of things just like fun things with my friends. I do a bunch of wild swimming now. It's like I live around the corner from a lake. And even though it's like very cold, it's like very intense, very fun. As a flight, I've bought some spike ball. I don't know if you've played it, but it's like the most fun it's possible to have, I would claim. And
is that when you just sort of hit a ball into somebody?
No, but that game sounds fun too.
Yeah,
no, it's like this kind of like little trampoline, and like you hit a ball against it. And yeah, I had like a party on Friday night, and we were playing it then.
So what are your plans going forward? So we've heard about the book, about your work with Future Fund. What does 2022 hold for you?
Yeah, so I think I'm really thinking of 2022 as kind of like exploratory for me. It's very unclear like how should I be spending my time after that point, where there are a bunch of there's a bunch of ways it could go. So it depends on, you know, how's the book launch, and how am I feeling about that? How does the Future Fund go? How am I feeling about that? How's EA going and how I feel about that? And so, you know, one natural thing to do is like the public intellectual thing, and it's like I spend a lot more time writing books and articles and appearing in the media and doing this kind of broad comms. Another natural thing that I could focus on would be trying to lead a project myself, where one of the two things I could most obviously see myself like being really excited about would be a kind of research institute. So I really feel the weight of just how many open questions there are, in particular in these areas that don't naturally fit into academia. So questions like, you know, what's the chance of how harder would it be for civilization to collapse? How likely would we be to recover? That was something there's like no research at all on. I got Luisa Rodriguez to work on it. Just like, it was really excellent to move from 0 to 1 there. It would be nice to have like a lot more, like, now we have this like one person who's worked on it, but it would be nice for there to be like, no, this is just like a major research field is this one question. And there are many other such, questions that I think are similarly as important. And I think like probably that just needs to happen outside of academia, because like you just can't publish in good journals. Another one would be on the educational side. So I get kind of, yeah, I could imagine like trying to create some sort of like educational institute that's focused on like what I would regard as like the most important sources of knowledge. So that's another thing I could imagine. I could also imagine like spending more of my time on Future Fund work, where something I'm kind of helping with is in particular kind of matchmaking between founders and projects. So I don't know, I have these kind of two streams of things I've like found myself drawn to in the past. One is this kind of public intellectually work, and the other thing is like having an idea for some organization that could exist and like helping make it happen. And maybe I should be doing that much more, and then Future Fund would be the natural home.
Yeah, I guess that's the kind of the meta thing, rather than starting the thing yourself, helping a bunch of other people start the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And for the kind of research institute, are there any organizations that you see doing this kind of work now? You know, would that institute could that potentially turn into an academic institute if it becomes a reputable enough field?
Great question. So who's doing that most now? Open Phil Worldview Investigations team. would definitely just be the model there. I'm enormous fan of the work they're doing. And it's just, it's very focused on, primarily it's issues around AI timelines, which are obviously like exceptionally important, and also takeoff speeds as well of AI. There are just like many questions, so I don't know. This vision would be kind of like taking that and multiplying it 10 times over. Rethink Priorities also does like a fair bunch of research in this area too. As for whether it could be become an academic institute, I don't know. I can't really think of examples that have been successful there. You have fields that would have been regarded as very messy, and then became academic fields, but normally kind of lower status academic fields. So I don't know, I know philosophy pretty well, but medical ethics and bioethics, these are, the issues they address are it's more messy, it's more interdisciplinary, and are relatively new as fields. But they do get regarded as kind of not as prestigious within the academy. And I would rather have something that was prestigious and outside of the academy than non-prestigious and within. And so it might be we just want to create our own, it's also we might just want to create our own intellectual ecosystem that.
And it's not just prestigious, it's they are then able to, in fact, just do the research they want to do and answer the questions they want to do rather than being hamstrung by what academia would kind of force people into.
Yeah, exactly. Academia has a set of incentives. It can be very good when those incentives are aligned in the right ways. Obviously, it's produced enormous value in the past, but it is also very constraining, especially for, this sort of very messy, extremely multidisciplinary research that is often the stuff that we think is most important. And it's most important on the margin precisely because it's something that academia is not very well set up to do.
I guess you can get the research out there much more quickly. You'll know much better than I how long it takes to get a paper published, but it's sometimes a very long time.
It's wild. The first major publication I had, I think it took 5 years from writing the first, the thing that I sent to a journal and it getting published. Similarly, writing this book, it's painfully slow, where I finished the final version in December and it comes out in August. And that's I don't know, if you imagine this feedback loop, how much progress do you make? Where, well, if you can have publication and someone can respond the next week and then it's you respond the next week, rather than, hey, you write this thing, 12 months later it comes out and then they can respond another 12 months. Well, how much progress do you make from each of these two things? I think one could create a research ecosystem that was, potentially just radically faster moving. But I think you kind of need to start it from scratch.
Great, and I think for our final question, what are you really excited about for the community for 2022? What do you want people to take away from this conference and for people to work on and be excited by?
Yeah, loads of things. I think the thing I'll most say is just a move. So the Future Fund did this project ideas competition, and the response was just overwhelming, 700 suggestions, which I went through, or I did half and another person did another half. So that was just overwhelming. And then this kind of open call, again, just enormous kind of number of applications. And I'm just really excited about this. So I think it used to be the case that the thing people were most thinking about was kind of cause prioritization. And that makes sense if you're oh, I'm just pretty small compared to all of the things we could be working on. It's where does my $1,000 go? Should it be on something AI or global development? Whereas now, instead, it's especially within like AI, like bio, like lots of the best things have already been funded, and the gap is much more like having fleshed out project ideas, where that's not just, I don't know, not just like, oh, an EA marketing organization or something, where, or like a, I don't know, you can have some very broad idea, but like the value is like, no, this really concrete change that you could make to the world. Ideally with like, oh, and this person could run it and so on. That's just so valuable at the moment. And it seems to me like when I'm now thinking about like how excited am I about different projects, the question of just like, look, tell me the details of the project is starting to weigh much, much larger than what cause area does this fund like fall under. And that kind of like, it makes sense, because if you think like, oh, X is the most important cause, well, it just keeps getting funded until it's no longer the most important cause. And so you actually should expect, like, if we're acting rationally, it to be much, the distribution of the best things to be much flatter over causes. And it actually seems to me like that's what we're seeing. So.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, it was great chatting to you and hearing about what you've been up to. So can you please join me in thanking Will?
Okay, thank you.